Hello children, I hope you all are doing fine. I welcome you all to our special English hour. Here we learn lots of new things and we learn these things while having fun. Are you all ready for some fun? Let's get started. So today let's read the second part of Red-Headed League and let's find out how Sherlock Holmes solved this mystery. Children, you all know how important it is for us to learn new words. So before we read the second part of the story, let's learn some new words. Strand, strand, strand. A strand of hair was falling on her face. Route, route, route. He took a different route to reach his home. Seized, seized, seized. She seized the opportunity. Admiration, admiration, admiration. Everyone looked at her with admiration. Peculiar, peculiar, peculiar. There was a peculiar smell coming from the room. Children, now let's read the second part of our story. Please open page number 82 of your textbook. Now, I will be reading this story and I request you to point at the words as I read them. And if you don't have a textbook, listen to me carefully. अब मैं ये कहानी पढ़ूंगी और मैं चाहती हूँ कि आप भी अपने टेक्स्ट बुक में पॉइंट करें और अगर आपके पास टेक्स्ट बुक ना हो तो आप मुझे ध्यान से सुनिए. Part 2. What happened next? Dr. Watson's account. Well, Watson, what do you think of it all? Asked Mr. Holmes after Mr. Wilson had left. I make nothing of it, I answered frankly. Holmes sat silently for some time and then invited me to go out with him. We went to the square where Mr. Wilson had his shop. Holmes observed the area carefully. There were many shops and offices in the square, and a bank just behind Mr. Wilson's shop. Holmes spent some time outside the shop and thumped upon the pavement 2 or 3 times. Finally, he knocked on Mr. Wilson's door. A young man opened the door. Mr. Holmes asked him the way to the Strand. The assistant answered the question and quickly closed the door. As you all remember that when we read Sherlock Holmes stories, it's always Dr. Watson who narrates the story. So here, after Mr. Wilson left, Holmes started asking questions to Dr. Watson. He asks Dr. Watson what is his opinion, and Dr. Watson says that he doesn't understand any of it. So Sherlock Holmes starts thinking, and after a few minutes he makes up his mind, and he and Dr. Watson leave the house. After a while they reach Mr. Wilson's office. Sherlock Holmes tries spending some time there, and he starts thinking. While he's standing there, he observes the surroundings, and he sees that there are many shops and there is one bank behind Mr. Wilson's office. After a while, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson go to Mr. Wilson's shop. They knock the door, and after a while, Mr. Wilson's assistant opens the door. Sherlock doesn't tell him anything. He asks for a way to go to Strand. Strand is a place in London, and the assistant tells Sherlock Holmes the way to Strand, and after that he closes the door. I said, I'm sure that you enquired your way only in order to see him. Not him, Holmes said, but the knees of his trousers. And what did you see? What I expected to see. This matter of Wilson's is serious. A crime is being planned. But I hope that we can stop it. Today is Friday. The offices and banks will be closed on the weekend. Now I've to go and make some arrangements. But I shall want your help tonight. Come to Baker Street at 10 and bring your revolver. While Sherlock Holmes was talking to Mr. Spaulding, Dr. Watson was observing. After Mr. Spaulding closes the door, Dr. Watson asks Sherlock if he wanted to speak to Mr. Spaulding. And to that, Sherlock Holmes replies that he was not interested in Mr. Spaulding but his trousers. Doesn't that sound odd? Mr. Watson also felt that this was odd. But Sherlock Holmes doesn't give further explanation. He tells Dr. Watson that this is a very serious affair and he thinks that a crime is being planned. But Sherlock has a solution to it. He tells Dr. Watson to come to Baker Street. Baker Street is the place where Sherlock Holmes lives. So he calls Dr. Watson at Baker Street at 10 in the night. And he also asks him to get a revolver. I arrived at Holmes' residence in time. There were two other men with him, Mr. Jones of Scotland Yard and Mr. Merriweather, a banker. Holmes announced, "Tonight we are going to hunt one of the smartest criminals in London." We left together in a carriage and reached the road we had visited in the morning. Holmes told us to follow Mr. Merriweather, who led us through an iron gate. We followed him down a narrow passage. After going down some stone steps, he led us down a dark, earth-smelling passage and into a huge cellar full of big boxes. We all sat on the boxes. Now, as told, Dr. Watson reaches Sherlock Holmes' place at 10 p.m. and he sees that there are two more people at Sherlock's house, and they are Mr. Jones of Scotland Yard and Mr. Merriweather. Mr. Jones was a Scotland Yard officer and Mr. Merriweather was a banker. After a while, all these four people get into a carriage and then they reach the place where they had gone in the morning. Now, all of them get off the carriage and they start following Mr. Merriweather and they enter a passage. A passage is like a small lane. They walk into the dark passage and they reach a cellar. Cellar is an underground place. So, when they reach the cellar, they see that there are many boxes. So, all four of them sit on those boxes. We are in the cellar of the city branch of one of the main banks in London. Mr. Merriweather is the chairman of the bank and he will tell you why a criminal should take an interest in this cellar at present, said Holmes. Mr. Merriweather explained that the bank had borrowed a huge quantity of gold from the Bank of France, and the boxes in the cellar were full of gold. Holmes expected the criminals to act that very night. We had to wait there in total darkness without making any noise to take the criminals by surprise. Once all of them are in the cellar, Sherlock Holmes tells them that they are in the biggest cellar of the biggest bank in London. And further, he explains what they are doing here. Mr. Merriweather is the chairman of the bank, and this bank had recently borrowed huge quantities of gold from the Bank of France, and all these boxes were filled with gold. So Sherlock Holmes knew that all these criminals were going to act tonight, and they planned to catch these criminals red-handed, which is why they were hiding in the cellar. They have but one escape route, whispered Holmes. That is back through Mr. Wilson's house. I hope that some men are waiting at Mr. Wilson's door. Mr. Jones, I have an inspector and 2 officers waiting at his door. Then we have stopped all the holes. Now we must be silent and wait. Sherlock tells everyone that all these criminals only have one escape route, which means that they have only one way from where they can get out, and that way passes through Mr. Wilson's house. We waited silently for more than an hour. It was pitch dark in the cellar. Then suddenly a point of bright light appeared in the floor of the cellar. Then a line and a gash seemed to open, and a hand appeared. A broad stone turned over upon its side and left a square hole. A boyish face emerged. The man looked about and came out of the hole. He had a companion with him, a man with very red hair. The pair was none other than Spaulding, the assistant alias, the criminal Clay, and red-headed Mr. Duncan Ross. As soon as they climbed out of the hole, Sherlock Holmes sprang out and seized Clay by the collar. The other dived down the hole and disappeared. Clay took out a revolver, but Holmes hit him on his wrist and the revolver fell on the floor. It's no use, John Clay, said Holmes. We have got you. So I see, but my friend has escaped, Holmes replied. He cannot escape. There are 3 men waiting for him at the other end. Then Holmes handed over Mr. Clay to the policeman. Mr. Merriweather said, Really, Mr. Holmes, I do not know how to thank you. You have foiled one of the most cunning attempts at bank robbery. The bank is grateful to you. You see, Watson, Holmes said after we reached his home. It was obvious from the first that the only possible object of the strange advertisement and the peculiar job was to get Mr. Wilson away from his shop for some hours every day. The Red-Headed League was a clever idea. In Mr. Wilson's absence, Clay and his red-headed companion wanted to dig an underground tunnel from Mr. Wilson's house to the bank. Then they would be able to enter the bank and steal the gold without breaking open the doors of the bank. Using the tunnel, they entered the cellar. They planned to steal the gold and go back to Mr. Wilson's house again through the tunnel and then get away. Mr. Merriweather feels very grateful towards Sherlock and he thanks him. After this, Sherlock and Dr. Watson go back to Sherlock's house, and that's where he tells Dr. Watson how he was able to solve this mystery. When Sherlock listens to Mr. Wilson, he realizes that the only job of Red-Headed League was to take out Mr. Wilson from his office for a few hours. And why was that? This was so that Mr. Spaulding and his other friends could create a tunnel from Mr. Wilson's house to the bank, which is the cellar. And their plan was to take out all the gold from the bank and disappear from Mr. Wilson's house. And Sherlock was able to crack this code. But how could you guess what their motive was? When I heard that the assistant worked for half the wages, I became suspicious. Using Mr. Wilson's description of his assistant, I made enquiries. I found that he was the criminal Clay. Why was he working in Mr. Wilson's shop? And his habit of going into the cellar every now and then. I inferred that he must be digging a tunnel to some other building. When we visited the shop, I beat upon the pavement with my stick to find out whether the cellar stretched out in front or behind. It was not in front. I saw the bank on the other side of the house and guessed what the criminals had in mind. When Clay answered the bell, the knees of his trousers were wrinkled and stained. It confirmed my suspicion that he was digging. You know the rest of the story. You reasoned it out beautifully, I exclaimed in admiration. Children, I hope you enjoyed this two-part story. Now, for homework, I request you to find out 3 more detective stories. These stories can be in any language, and you can find out about these stories from your family members and friends. Now, I will end this session on that note, and I will see you in our next session. Until then, take care and stay safe. Bye.